Exhibit 119.
Okay, we're back.
Page 56, and we were starting to discuss what your training is regarding handcuffing. Could you please explain to the jury how you train Minneapolis police officers in handcuffing techniques and the use of force?
Yes, sir. Well, we teach several different positional handcuffing techniques, as well as how to approach people when they're going to be handcuffed. And then once you make contact with the person, how to properly place the cuffs and procedures after.
How do you properly place the cuffs?
Well, one cuff at a time, and then once they're on and everything's under control in Code 4, as we call it.
They were never Code 4. And they were never, everything was settled or stable.
Things have calmed down to the point where you have control of the subject. You want to make sure that you check the fit of the cuffs and double lock them for their safety. They tend to, behind your back, if you sit down, they tend to tighten up on a person. So we want to be mindful of the fit of the handcuffs.
And the double locking prevents the further tightening of the handcuffs?
Yes, sir. The double lock is just a little button that you use your cuff key to push, and it prevents the cuffs from either coming undone or going in.
And there's several different positions that an officer can be in when they're handcuffing a suspect. Is that right?
I'm sorry, can you
The officer could be in many different positions relative to the subject when they're handcuffing them.
Absolutely. Very dynamic. Yes, sir.
Standing,
Yes, sir.
prone.
Yes, sir.
Right. And I'd like you to please describe for the jury what techniques are used to prone handcuff a subject.
With prone handcuffing, we want to make sure that we isolate an arm. And a lot of times we teach the officers to use a knee to control their shoulder. Generally, you put one knee on each side of the arm, so one would be on the upper shoulder, one about middle of the back, excuse me. And then isolate that arm, present the wrist for cuffing, and then handcuff. And a lot of times when you're doing the prone cuffing, you do that with a partner preferably. It makes it a lot easier to control the person.
And if someone is handcuffed and you're using your knee on their back or shoulder to gain control, do you leave it there for an extended period of time?
It depends on the circumstance. You can leave it there for a longer period of time depending on the resistance you get.
And what would signal to you as a trainer?
Not only the resistance you get, but the stabilization of the crowd or the scene. If the scene is not stable and secure, then that's a low priority.
When you're supposed to release your knee?
When their behavior de-escalates their resistance.
Relative to the handcuffing?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Yeah,
Compliance.
No. So once you've accomplished the handcuffing, once the subject's actually been handcuffed, is that the appropriate time to release your leg?
Not necessarily.
Why?
When people are handcuffed in the prone position, they can thrash around, writhe around, and they do present a little bit of a threat. They can kick, bite, some other things. So control doesn't end with handcuffing always.
Good answer. That was a fair answer.
If
The defense didn't want to hear that answer, but that was a fair answer.
subject is resisting, correct?
That's correct.
The mere possibility that it's potential that a subject could resist like that kicking, is that justification to leave your leg in place?
No, sir. I would say you need behavior that would lead you to leave your knee there.
So once the subject is handcuffed and compliant or not resisting, is the officer to remove their knee?
That would be an appropriate time.
Damn.
And how long then is the person, the subject, to be left in the prone handcuffed position once they're compliant?
Depends.
It depends on the circumstances that you're involved in with this person and the surrounding environment.
So assume the circumstances that I just stated. The subject is prone, handcuffed, and no longer resisting.
I think when it's reasonably necessary, you have the time to do it, then you should get them in a different position.
What
What you just explained is not what Chauvin was in. It wasn't secure.
position is that?
It depends on circumstances, but
I'm glad he's starting to use it depends. My answer in a lot of legal terms is it depends. Totality of circumstances. There's no one right answer. There's no always absolutes 100%.
you can put them in the recovery position on their side. You can sit them up. You can stand them up.
And why would you want to put them into a different position?
There is the possibility and risk that that some people have difficulty breathing when the handcuffs are behind their back and they're on the stomach.
And what is that known as?
Positional asphyxia.
I'm sorry, rephrase.
Are you familiar with the phrase positional asphyxia?
Oh, yes, sir.
Is that the danger you would be trying to avoid by putting someone in the side recovery position?
That is one of the dangers you're trying to avoid, yes.
Sustained. Last answer, stricken, rephrase.
You testified that you're familiar with the term positional asphyxia.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Why would you roll someone into the side recovery position after they've been handcuffed and are compliant?
Several reasons are there, but one would be to prevent a potential situation where they might be subject to positional asphyxiation.
And how soon is a subject to be placed into the side recovery position after they become compliant and no longer resistant?
When it's safe to do so.
When the scene is code for and you're able to do it.
In terms of subject safety, how soon should the person be put into the side recovery?
It can't be just subject safety because there's too many things, variable factors that go into an officer's decision, such as his experience, his prior training, the level of resistance, and the length of time of resistance of the suspect. So to say when in an isolated incident would be much different than in a reality. Which one would you like me to answer? That's the way I would have answered it.
Recovery position.
I would say sooner the better.
Now, you testified that there are circumstances in which the subject can offer further resistance even though they're handcuffed. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to direct your attention to page 58 of Exhibit 219. This slide discusses the maximal restraint technique. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is there a particular device that's used to accomplish the maximal restraint technique?
Yes, sir. It's the RIP restraint or the RIP hobble.
Can you please describe the maximal restraint technique to the jury?
Yes, sir. If you have a subject that is handcuffed behind their back, generally, and that's the way we like to handcuff people, and they continue to cause a threat to you or other people or themselves, we have taught our officers to use the maximal restraint technique, which is taking this RIP restraint, which is a nylon strap with a clamp on it, and you would wrap that around their legs and then connect it to the front of the body, if possible, like a belt loop or a second restraint around their waist. And what that does is it bends their legs so that their legs are no longer a threat to kick out at you. Kind of put their legs at about a 90-degree angle so they're not able.
It also stops them from fighting. It takes away their strength and their leverage, and it also prevents them from running away if they get up. So you can relax and not sit on them and try to hold them down.
Able to extend the legs out to kick you if they are a threat.
Are you aware that the use of the maximal restraint technique is guided and governed by MPD policy?
Yes, sir, it is.
And that's 5-316?
That's correct.
All right.
We used to just call it a hobble. I carried mine. I still have mine hanging around here somewhere. And I thought I demonstrated it in one of my videos on how to put a hobble or different ways to hobble somebody. But then people were complaining. Certain people of certain color said it was not fair, and a lot of agencies did away with it.
Is there more than one
burn, loot, murder
device that's authorized to perform the maximal restraint technique?
I believe it right now it's just the RIP or the RIP hobble is the one we use.
And so if an officer reasonably believes that a subject is thrashing, would you recommend that they use this maximal restraint technique to ensure their safety?
Yes, sir.
And if they do so in accordance with MPD policy 5-316 in your training, what does the officer need to do after the subject has been placed in the MRT and is prone?
Place them in the recovery position.
How soon?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible and as soon as it's safe to do so. He keeps leaving out. See, he's kind of fallen into the prosecutor's boy by leaving out the part as soon as it's safe to do so, because that's a factor that is always taught and is always in the officer's mind. And this scene was not safe. A mob was gathering. There had been riots in months and weeks before this. They were in a hostile area known to be hostile toward police, and we had people calling their names and yelling at them and stepping off the carbon failure and encroaching on their position, and they were a constant threat, and they keep leaving that out.
Why?
Because when you further restrict their ability to move, it can further restrict their ability to breathe.
The defense could ask, if this situation happened at the police department where it was a safe, secure environment, would you agree that there would have been no excuse for not turning him over? And he would say, yes, I would agree with that. But if it happens in a neighborhood that's known for high violence and you've got people in a crowd gathering with riots in the area, would you say that there may be a reason it wasn't done in that situation? That's where I'd get him to say if I was a defense. And I know people are going to say I'm
in terms of
for Chauvin.
The appropriateness of force, would you agree with the proposition that force must be reasonable when it's applied?
course.
Yes, sir.
And would you also agree that circumstances can change?
Absolutely.
Subject behavior can change,
Yes, sir.
right? The environment can change.
Yes, sir.
And you familiar with Minneapolis MPD critical thinking model?
The critical decision-making model?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And that's kind of a graphic that I haven't asked the question yet.
Hard not to be leading with that. Let's try and rephrase this.
Is the critical thinking model a graphical representation of a different concept?
I don't know if I understand that question, sir.
Are you familiar with the concept of reassessment?
A reassessment? Absolutely.
Can you describe reassessment to the jury?
Yes, sir. Through the
You're always evaluating the scene, the person, the health. You're always getting new information so you know what next is safe and reasonable to proceed.
critical decision-making model, we've put basically a template together for officers to look at and to understand their thinking processes. And reevaluation is when you're looking at circumstances that you're involved in, and you're constantly looking for factors to change so you can change your behavior.
And is reassessment something that you've been teaching even before the advent of this model?
Oh yes, it's paramount to use of force.
And so there can be a point in time when a particular type of force is reasonable, but as time passes, circumstances can change,
Yes, sir.
and then that force would no longer be reasonable.
That's correct.
And if that's the case, what is the officer to do?
They're to change their force.
They're to follow the law and always use reasonable force necessary to complete their task.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Wow, he didn't really go after him that much. I'm kind of surprised. I figured he'd be up here for a while.
Mr. Nelson.
All right, here comes the defense. Hopefully he digs into this guy. This guy is his best adversary or his best witness. If he takes him down the right path, this guy will answer honestly. Should. Let me rephrase that.
I may have
Should.
just a moment, Your Honor.
Now, we're always a little bit more defensive when the defense gets up there because we know they're trying to make us look bad or get us in a trick or to get us to cross our words. So there's always a little bit
Good morning,
of...
sir.
Good morning.
Had to check
I gotta
the
be
time.
more
Thank
careful
you for
with
being
the
with us
defense.
today. I have a few follow-up questions regarding the training the Minneapolis Police Department provides. You testified that one of your specialties, or I believe that you talked about how you developed the ground defense program.
I was one of the people that founded it, yes.
Okay. Can you just describe generally what is the ground defense program?
It's using techniques other than strikes to control individuals. I mean, that's the broad term.
And essentially that was a program that was introduced some 10, 15 years ago to the MPD?
I believe it's 10 years now.
Okay. And that's using different, like jujitsu.
Ground fighting. Most agencies want you to do more pinning and restraining than punching, hitting, tasering, batoning, because it doesn't look as bad and you can control the subject by using less force if you know how to use that.
Moves or different body control methods versus punching or striking an individual, right?
That's correct.
And that was a program, again, that you helped develop and found, and you continued to train throughout the Minneapolis Police Department during your...
I like where he's going here because he's going to get into, isn't pinning a suspect on the ground a safe maneuver so you don't have to fight with him and punch him if he's actively resisting? I think that's where he's going.
a time as in the training division, right?
That's correct, sir.
And it's fair to say that when you train a police officer, you're training them in particular moves that will help improve their ability to gain compliance of a subject, right?
That's the goal, yes, sir.
But certainly there's no strict application of every single rule, agreed? Or every single technique.
That is correct.
Officers,
Objection. Which question is it for? Every move or every...
Objection is sustained. Compound question. Rephrase.
Sure.
Answers are stricken.
So he asked a couple questions in there, and this is what lawyers do. They want to make statements, and I'll get 2 or 3 questions to get you to answer yes, and later I'll only cherry pick part of the question and say, didn't you answer yes to this question? So that's why you want them to say, no, ask each specific question so you don't trick my witness.
there is no strict application of every technique that an officer is trained, is there?
No.
Officers are trained to be fluid, correct?
Yes, sir.
And sometimes officers have to do things that are unattractive to other people
Correct.
in terms of the use of force.
Yes, sir.
And an officer, you would agree that being a police officer is a relatively dangerous job?
Yes, sir.
You yourself, in the course of your career,
Oh, he's getting into danger. That's good. State of mind is critical. State of mind not only to the reasonable officer, but remember, it's not just the reasonable officer standard. It's the reasonable officer standard with the same experience and training. So Chauvin has to be judged on a 20-year veteran with his training and experience, not by a lieutenant who's promoted every year and has been in the back office for 20 years. That's not how the reasonable standard is applied.
have had to use force against suspects.
Yes, sir.
You've arrested many people, I presume.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that sometimes people aren't particularly happy about being arrested?
Very rarely, sir.
And sometimes they fight with you.
Yes, sir.
And sometimes they argue with you.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes they make excuses.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, one of the things that a police officer has to do is try to determine, is this person pretending or trying to give me some excuse not to get arrested, or is this person experiencing some other crisis, right?
Yes.
Right? And ultimately,
You don't always believe a suspect. Is that correct? Suspects lie, correct?
in terms of an arrest, that's one of the things that an officer has to ascertain, right?
Yes, sir.
And again, when you've arrested people, have you had people plead with you not to arrest them?
Yes, sir.
Have you had people say they were having a medical emergency?
Yes, sir.
Have you had people say, I can't breathe?
Yes, sir.
And were there circumstances during the course of your career as a patrol officer where you didn't believe that that person was having a medical emergency?
Yes, sir.
Every officer does that. Great. That was a great question, great answer. He's an experienced guy. He's the expert. And now I'm going to get to say my client experienced the exact same thing that the prosecution expert testified to.
And that's all part of the analysis in terms of the use of force, right?
It plays a part, yes, sir.
And so if someone comes to you and says, if you tell someone I'm under arrest, one way that a person can resist arrest is through the use of their words. Agreed?
Yes, sir.
And that's a form of what you would call passive
Passive.
resistance.
Depending on the types of words that are used.
Right. So words could be both passive or active resistance, right?
I would say yes.
Right. So
I don't know if I would say words would be active. Maybe if a guy's punching you and he says, I'm going to kill you, you could construe that those words are active, but I don't think words can be active aggressive, personally.
the difference between
Excuse me.
I'm having a heart attack versus screw you, you're not going
excuse
to
me.
take me.
Oh, yeah, yes.
So that's what you mean by the difference in the words, right?
That's correct.
Or if a suspect is threatening you when you're arresting.
That's correct.
All right. Now, the whole concept of this ground defense program, as you testified, was to really use body weight and control to gain compliance of a subject, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that in any use of force situation, the circumstances can change from minute to minute, second to second?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So somebody who is initially compliant can suddenly become non-compliant.
Yes.
That's correct.
Somebody who's peacefully going into custody could suddenly become violent towards an
Yes.
officer.
That's correct.
Somebody who is violent in 1 second, becomes compliant, could become violent again, right?
Yes, sir.
You've experienced that yourself, correct?
I have.
And an officer, in terms of the use of force, you don't train officers specifically to only focus on.
I think he's doing a really good job with this defense. I guarantee you the prosecution is going to have to re-examine this witness to try and negate some of this damage he's done. The prosecution does not want the jury to remember this right here. This is a really good cross, in my opinion.
On the individual that they're taking into custody, do you?
No.
Do you train them on officers to consider and to take into consideration other factors,
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
such as their partner safety,
That's
Correct.
correct.
such as
Scene security.
a crowd,
Correct.
such as the difference between a crowd, right?
Yes, sir.
Are they a happy crowd or are they an angry crowd?
Yes, sir.
In terms of, we talked about the proportionality of the use of force and kind of sliding force up and down that model.
Sliding scale.
Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
When an officer uses force, do you train officers to take into consideration what happened immediately prior to the use of a particular use of
Yes.
force?
Could you rephrase that, sir? I'm sorry.
Sure.
What he's trying to ask is, if a person was actively resisting, isn't that part of how much force you're going to use and whether you continue that force? And if he was sporadic and possibly under influence and was changing, becoming compliant to non-compliant, isn't that an officer, an experienced officer, wouldn't he consider that a trend and would become possibly ready to expect that type of behavior to continue? He could be phrasing it some way to that effect.
In terms of the continuation of the use of force, do you train officers to take into consideration what has happened with that suspect in the immediate preceding events?
Yes, sir.
So, for example, if you were just fighting with a suspect and that person becomes compliant, does that become a consideration in terms of a continued use of force?
Yes, sir.
If someone has a sizable or a large size difference, do you train officers to take that into consideration in terms of their use of force?
Yes, sir.
So if some person
If somebody just got away from 3 officers and it takes 3 officers to hold him down because of his violent resistive actions, trying to get away and trying to stand up and trying to resist arrest, is that a factor?
had fought with more than one officer at a time, do you train officers to take that into consideration as far as the continuing use of force?
Yes, sir.
So 1 person against 3 people is a factor that officers would consider for the continued use of force.
Yes, sir.
Do you train officers relevant to the use of force for people who are under the influence of controlled substances?
It's a consideration, yes.
And in your experience, have you ever had to use force against somebody who's under the influence of a controlled substance?
Yes, sir.
Hopefully he goes into the lack of pain. Plain compliance don't work on people under the influence because their pain receptors are dulled. Okay, we're back.
Do you train officers that certain controlled substances can cause a person to exhibit more strength than they would have otherwise?
Yes, sir.
So going back to the ground defense program, the ground defense program really uses a lot of joint manipulations, correct?
Yes, sir.
Pressure points,
Not so much pressure points with ground control.
okay. Body weight pins.
Yes, sir.
Using the officer's body weight to physically control an individual, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what about weight disparity?
Now, you were previously
Size.
interviewed by the FBI in connection with this case,
Yes, sir.
and you are aware that your statement was recorded, transcribed, and have you had an opportunity?
Why is the FBI interviewing all these people when this is a state investigation? Because if they don't convict Chauvin, just like when they didn't convict the officers on Rodney King, the feds are ready to come in and charge him with civil rights crimes and get a conviction to appease burn, loot, murder. And that is why the feds are involved, in my opinion.
Were you aware of that?
I was aware of that.
Have you had an opportunity to review your statement to the FBI?
Nope.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you just some general questions, and if I need to refresh your recollection, I'll do so. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
So, in terms of Minneapolis Police Department policy, there's a difference between a chokehold and a neck restraint, correct?
That's correct.
A chokehold is considered a lethal or deadly use of force, correct?
Correct.
And a chokehold is defined by Minneapolis policy as specifically blocking the trachea or the airway of the suspect from the front side, correct?
Correct.
So essentially what you would kind of think of as almost strangulation, putting your hands around someone's neck and squeezing the front of their neck, correct?
Yes, sir.
In this particular case, have you had an opportunity to review the body-worn cameras, the bystander surveillance, or the bystander cameras?
I have seen both, sir.
Okay. At any point, did you see Officer Chauvin use a choke hold in this case?
No, sir.
Woo!
No.
That's a good question, because everybody keeps saying he was choking him. Now you just have the expert said, no, he did not use a chokehold. Good.
In terms of neck restraints, you testified that you have been involved in the martial arts since college,
Yes, sir.
and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that you also train MMA fighting.
No, sir, I do not.
Have you ever?
No, sir.
But in the course of your training, both in martial arts as well as like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and your training to become a use of force instructor, you have experienced neck restraints, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you have taught individual officers, I believe you say hundreds of times, and hundreds of officers on how to use a neck restraint, correct?
Yes, sir.
And a neck restraint, as you have described it, requires both sides of the neck to be compressed in order to render a person unconscious, correct?
That is what we teach, yes.
He left an opening there. That is what we teach. The prosecution will come back. Isn't it possible that if you cut off one side, he could pass out? I'm not sure. I've never seen anybody pass out from one side. And I'm not even sure his knee was on a carotid. I'm not even sure you can get a knee on a carotid artery when a guy is in the prone position, because the carotid arteries are more on the front, closer to the trachea on the side of the neck. And I'm not sure you can stop it with your knee when you're on top of him and he's facing down.
How much pressure has to be applied to both sides of the neck in order to render a person unconscious based on your training?
It depends.
Okay. On what factors?
Size of the person, your skill, whether they're on narcotics or not, whether they're having an adrenaline rush, heart rate, general physical health. There's just a lot of factors.
Fatness of
Okay.
the person's neck.
Typically, do you have to apply a lot of pressure to, let's say, a healthy individual for a long period of time in order to render someone unconscious?
No.
I would say no.
Do you recall what is the percentage of pressure that you would generally expect to have to apply?
I don't know if I can.
Overruled.
So he asked him, what's the percentage? Instead of, if he says something different than what he answered over there, then he will say, do you remember? And they objected because they want him to show him the report first so he can answer. But you know what? He didn't answer. When you testified with the FBI, what did you say the percentage? He just asked him the question. What's the percentage? They objected. The court said, no, that's appropriate.
Question again, sir?
What amount of pressure do you have to apply typically
not what
in
you
order
said.
to
You said a
render someone
percentage.
unconscious?
I don't know if I can answer that.
He should have had the court reporter read back the question, because that's not the question he asked.
It's very individual.
So you said factors such as controlled substance use play into it, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if a suspect is on a controlled substance, does that speed up the process of rendering someone unconscious or slow it down?
Depends.
I think my experiences are that it speeds it up.
And if someone has, you said another factor is if someone has an adrenaline surge, right?
Yes, sir.
And if someone has an adrenaline surge coursing through their body, does a use of a neck restraint speed up or slow, or does that adrenaline speed up or slow down the unconsciousness?
Objection, Your Honor. This is beyond his basic knowledge and scope of work.
Any more foundation?
Your Honor, I can refresh his recollection with his statement if that recalls.
Your Honor, can we have a sidebar?
So it was okay when the FBI asked him and he answered, and now the prosecution doesn't want that in. I noticed that none of the FBI interviews are not been admitted. Maybe they were admitted and I don't know about it. But it's kind of funny that the prosecution knows everything they ask in the FBI and their different statements. But he's not saying, he doesn't want them put in.
No. Proceed.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your statement relevant to adrenaline and the impact of how it speeds up or slows down a neck restraint?
I don't believe I need to see that.
Okay.
I know the answer.
What's the answer?
The answer is the higher your blood rate or your respiration and heart rate is, generally the faster a neck restraint affects somebody.
And how long, based on your training and experience, does it typically take to render a person unconscious using a neck restraint?
Wow, I'm not sure I could answer that. I'd say it varies. I can take you out in 2 seconds or 10 seconds, depending on if you're fighting and I don't get a good hold, or you're twisting and you suddenly get a little release. It's very hard to say exactly.
Restraint.
My experience is under 10 seconds.
Under 10 seconds?
That's a fairly reasonable answer. 10 seconds if you get it on good and tight and you hold it.
Yes, sir.
Now, when a neck restraint is applied, does the Minneapolis Police Department specifically train people to be cautious when reviving or attempting to revive a suspect?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sir.
In your experience, after a person has been rendered unconscious using a neck restraint, is it possible for them to continue to fight after they come back to consciousness?
It is possible, yes.
Have you experienced that personally?
I have not experienced somebody fighting after neck restraint.
Okay. But you're aware the Minneapolis Police Department trains.
Have you ever seen that? Because everybody's seen MMA fighters, when they get knocked out, when they come to, they jump up and want to fight. So that was a bad question. Have you experienced, when he said no, have you ever seen or witnessed that, either in person or in a fight or in a police situation, MMA, etc.? And he would have answered yes, because everybody's seen, who watches MMA, who's in defensive tactics, will know that when you come out, when you're knocked out or knocked down, you come up fighting like, what the hell, what happened, where am I?
People that is a possibility.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, sometimes they can be just as aggressive or even more aggressive after coming to consciousness.
That is possible, yes.
You got it in.
Now, in terms of the use of a neck restraint specifically, there are circumstances, are there not, where an officer can continue to hold a person in a neck restraint after rendering someone unconscious,
Hold somebody? Yes.
and for a period of time, correct?
Yes, sir. You can have your arm around their neck for a period of time. Yeah.
Okay, so the holding is a control technique, but you release the defense. The prosecution is going to come back and go, if you're holding somebody, are you still applying the same amount of pressure that you used to try and make them unconscious? And the answer will be no. I use more pressure to make them unconscious. Then once they're unconscious, I can still hold them, but I don't need to apply the same amount of pressure around the neck. And that would be the defense saying, you know, Chauvin did not release the pressure. But he can't say that, because Chauvin can release the pressure without you knowing it by shifting his weight from one knee to the other.
Yes.
And there would be circumstances that would affect an officer's decision on whether to hold that person in that position for some period of time, correct?
Yes, sir.
That would include maybe waiting for other officers to arrive,
Yes, sir.
waiting for EMS to arrive.
I don't know about that. I wouldn't go that far. No.
Okay.
Wouldn't go that far, no. Really? See, the question was bad because he put it in an isolated incident waiting for EMS to arrive. What he should have said is, if it takes 3 officers to hold him down and he was fighting and you have an angry crowd and you're waiting for EMS, would that be a reason to continue? He would have answered yes. Bad question.
You also train in the training department officers on what are called the human factors of force, correct?
Yes, sir.
And generally, can you describe what the human factors of force are?
Yes, sir. It involves either a startle response to the officer, or getting scared, or having an adrenaline rush or adrenaline dump in their body. And it affects your cognitive, physical abilities when you encounter stress like that.
So it's fair to say that when an officer is engaged in a use of force incident, him or herself, they may experience a rush of adrenaline as well, right?
Yes, sir.
You've experienced that yourself?
Yes, sir.
And after a situation has calmed down to some degree, the officer experiences an adrenaline rush, or dump, excuse me.
The adrenaline can continue.
He's talking about fight or flight on the, I think he's talking about fight or flight on the officer and not the suspect. And so far, this defense guy is pretty good, but I think he kind of did a disservice to his credibility when he said, no, I wouldn't do it for EMS. He could have clarified. There may be situations when you're waiting for EMS, if there's other factors that are being considered, that you would hold it. But just to hold a guy who's unconscious for EMS, I don't know if you still need to do that, but give me an example. Give me an example when you take a guy out, if you just totally let him go free and you stand up, you walk away and just wait for EMS in your car while he's laying there. Is that what you're saying? I mean, there's ways to get around this.
To course through the body, yes.
And at some point it leaves.
Yes, sir.
And that adrenaline, officers are trained on this, correct?
Yes, sir.
Well, they're not trained. You can't change that adrenaline. They're trained that they know how to experience, to be aware of it, and then try to work around it. But you can't stop the adrenaline. Should have been his answer.
Part of the standard training for both recruit officers in the academy as well as veteran officers in their in-service.
That's correct.
How frequently is the human factors of force taught to police officers?
I believe we teach it about once a year. We discuss the human factors of force.
He said, I believe, which means he really doesn't know, but he's guessing without testifying that it's fact. So, and I used I believe a lot too if I wasn't really sure, to give me wiggle room in case he comes back and go, would it surprise you if you teach it every 6 months? And, well, yeah, I said I believe once a year, but okay, if they teach it every 6 months, you have proof of that, I'll agree with that.
You also train officers to be very much aware of their surroundings at all times, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were asked a series of questions about continuing to hold someone in a prone position when you use the term, you could hold them there until the scene is code 4. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And so it's fair to say that the Minneapolis Police Department would train officers.
I don't think they've ever identified for the jury or explained or defined what Code 4 is. Code 4 is, I don't need any other help. The situation is settled. I have the guy in custody, and we're Code 4. Everything's fine. I don't think they've ever described that to the jury.
Under certain circumstances, to hold a person in a prone position until the scene is safe, correct?
There are circumstances where that is appropriate, yes.
And some of those circumstances could be the reaction of bystanders, correct?
That may be a factor, yes.
It could include where you are physically located in terms of a geographical area, correct?
Yes.
Right.
Well, he almost said no, and I would have slammed him on that one, because when you're in a hood, it's different than if you're, at a lawyer's office and you've got a stranger that walked in and did something. You got a bunch of lawyers standing around you in suits.
Where you are in terms of other hazards that may present themselves to an officer or to the suspect, right?
Yes, sir.
Being in a busy street, in the middle of a busy street, versus being in a...
He keeps bringing up busy street, and I haven't really addressed that a lot, but that was an unsafe. They had him. That guy jumped out of the car in the middle of a road, and we saw car after car after car speed by. That is very distracting, and officers are worried about getting hit or run over. So that's an also huge distractor that I haven't even brought up, and he keeps bringing that home, which is good on him.
Park or a yard or something.
Yes, sir.
Now, you also described the Minneapolis Police Department's policy in terms of rendering medical aid as best you can, right?
Yes.
An officer is required to do that, correct?
Yes, sir.
As best you can.
But there are certain circumstances, correct me if I'm wrong, where an officer has to consider whether it's safe for the officer to do so, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, the training that Minneapolis police officers receive requires it to be safe for an officer to render medical aid. Agreed?
Generally, yes.
And
Generally. So see, he left him a wiggle room there. The prosecution just wrote down that he said generally, and she wanted to come back and go, when you answer this question, you said generally. Can you give me an example when it wouldn't be? That's why when you're testifying, you can give clues to the prosecution or the defense on there's more information.
And one of the considerations an officer has to make in determining whether to render medical aid is whether or not the suspect is cuffed or uncuffed, right?
That's
That
one
may be a
factor.
factor, yes.
There are circumstances where you've been fighting with a person and you've gotten them handcuffed, and you have to decide, is it worth the risk to take these handcuffs off to give this person medical aid?
Yes, sir.
Because once you unhandcuff a suspect, they could become resistant again, correct?
That is correct.
You have to decide, is that a risk you're willing to take?
Yes, sir.
I don't know if I wouldn't have worded it that way. That's not a risk you're willing to take. You have to decide whether that risk is worth endangering your officers and yourself by taking that chance. I think that would have been a better way.
You also described the recovery position, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the recovery position could be rolling someone on their side, sitting them up, or standing them up, right?
Yes, sir.
And again, there would be circumstances, you can envision circumstances where you would not put a person into the recovery position, correct?
Yes, sir.
And
Man, that opened up a lot of things. What would there be circumstances that you wouldn't do it? I mean, he should have asked it, because everybody in the jury right now is, really? Well, what are those circumstances? And why didn't you ask him what they were? So the prosecution is going to come back and ask, what are those circumstances? Probably.
again, all of those factors that we've kind of talked about in terms of partner safety, personal safety, safety of the subject, safety of the crowd, all of those things are going through that critical decision.
So he tried to answer that himself, but that's not necessarily what the expert may say if you ask him what are those examples.
Making model process, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in terms of the use of body weight to hold a suspect, right? You train officers to use their knee across the back, shoulder, or the shoulder to the base of the neck of a subject, correct?
Yes.
That is something that is specifically trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, whether it be for handcuffing purposes or simply prone control of a subject.
Yes, sir.
So if a person is being handcuffed, officers are specifically trained to put a knee across the shoulder blade of the suspect to the trapezius, is that what it's called?
Yeah, trapezoid, yeah.
Something,
Yeah, sure. I'm not a medical doctor. So.
yeah. And that is routinely trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, both in terms of the academy as well as the
In service.
as well as in service.
Situationally, yes.
And
That's a pretty big point. I would have made that a bigger deal to the jury. So let me get this straight. The Minneapolis Police Department trains at the beginning of your career and during your career and in-service training that you put your knee across the shoulder and trapeze area very near the neck in order to handcuff. That is a standard taught procedure. Am I getting that right? I would have really driven that point home.
simply because a person is handcuffed, there would be other circumstances where you would use that body weight, that prone control technique to maintain control of a subject, correct?
Yes.
And I think he should have set that question up better by saying, because the Minneapolis Police Department teaches to put the neck or the knee in that area near the neck, that it's obviously a way to use the weight to control the suspect. Am I correct? Yes. And then ask this question. I would have set that question up because I want to drive that home to the jury.
And in terms of
It's 12:20 here in Texas, so it's 12:20 there. I don't know if they're going to finish with him or go over lunch. This witness is doing pretty good. I think, to me, when I'm testifying, I'm not testifying for the prosecution or defense. I'm trying to
could
educate the
publish
jury
Exhibit
with my
17.
experience and training and knowledge. So I elaborate a lot more than a lot of prosecutors like because I hurt their case when I tell the
if
facts.
we could publish Exhibit 17. You were asked a series of questions about whether this is appears to be a trained Minneapolis neck restraint.
Oh, I don't know if I go there because he's going to say, I train it for there. To me, it looks like his knee's on the neck. That's not what we train. We train it should be on the neck. If he does say that, the defense ought to be ready to say, isn't it true that sometimes if a suspect is moving, fighting, or resisting, it can cause the knee to slide from the area it's supposed to be and end up there? Is that true? And that would be yes.
Yes, I was asked that.
And you said no,
No.
correct?
Correct.
But it is, you hedged a little bit and said it may be some other training.
Perhaps.
What would that training be?
Using body weight to control. However, I will add that we tell officers to stay away from the neck when possible, and if you're going to use body weight to pin,
When possible. That's the key. When possible. Can a suspect's resistive actions, movement, and trying to get up cause a knee to move to the neck? Not because the officer wanted it there, but because the suspect's resistive actions caused it to be there. The answer would be yes.
to put it on their shoulder and be mindful of position.
All right. And we can take this down, and just to the witness, I'd like to display a couple of. This is page 41 of Exhibit 126. Just show this to the witness.
When this lawyer got up here, he said, I just have a few follow-up questions. To me, this is more than a few, but that's lawyer lingo. Sorry.
Can you see that, sir?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. Oop, this is already in evidence, but in this bottom corner here,
Yes.
do you see a photograph of an individual demonstrating how to handcuff a person?
Yes, sir.
And that knee is across the neck of that individual, correct?
The knee is on his far shoulder.
Across the neck, the base of the neck.
The shin would be from his toes up to the knee. Yes, the shin is across the back of the neck.
Okay?
So that's when we're talking about prone handcuffing. This is a specific kind of photograph that demonstrates the placement of a knee as it applies to prone handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
And ultimately, if that person were to be handcuffed and circumstances dictated, the officer would be permitted to continue to hold his knee in that same position. Agreed?
I would say yes, However, we've cautioned officers that be mindful of the neck area and to look for the shoulder for placement.
Sure. Well, of course we always caution them to do that. We caution them not to hit somebody in the head. We caution them to fire 1 round or 2 rounds and reassess. But they don't do it. They fire multiple rounds. Whatever. I mean, again, people think I'm defending Chauvin, and I'm not. I'm defending the injustice of this trial. They're only going after him because he's white and a black man died, and we see cops every day of all color acting inappropriately on all other people, and nothing is done.
Perfect. We can take this down. Can we take that down, Your Honor? I'm going to show you what has been introduced as Exhibit 56 already. Can you see that, sir?
A little glare, but yes, sir.
It appears to be the
Sure. Yes, sir.
it appears to be the paramedic checking the carotid pulse of Mr. Floyd.
Yes, sir.
In your experience, this is already admitted as Exhibit 56. In your experience, would you be able to touch the carotid artery if the knee was placed on the carotid artery?
Whoa, doggies. That's a great point.
No, sir.
So either the medical guy didn't know how to check it, or he wasn't on the carotid. Because if he was on the carotid artery, he couldn't have checked it. Man, great catch by the deep. This is a huge, enlightening moment for everyone that keeps saying he was kneeling on his carotid artery. Man, good move, attorney. Great point. The prosecution has got to re-question this
So I'm
guy.
showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 1045, 1045. Can you just generally take a look at that?
Yes, sir.
Now, in terms of, do you recognize that this appears to be a still photograph taken from the body-worn camera of one of the involved officers?
That's what it appears to be, yes.
There's a timestamp on it that indicates May 25th, 2020 at 20:23:32.
Yes, sir.
And can you see 2 officers in this area here holding Mr. Floyd?
Yes, sir.
And if I can clear this. Here, does that appear to be the placement of one officer's knee and leg?
Yes, sir.
Does that appear to be across the shoulder blade to the base of the neck?
The shin appears to be across the shoulder blade. I don't know if I can tell you where the knee is.
So we'll just, I would offer 1045.
Just foundationally, Your Honor, to identify
Officer King.
no objection.
All right, 1045 is received.
Permission to publish.
I
we
want to
clear
see
that?
this too, because if this is
So
going
what
to tell
we're
me
seeing
whether
here,
this guy's
again,
credible.
this is at 8:23 and 32 seconds, correct?
Yes, sir.
And obviously this is taken from one of the body cameras, and here you can see down in that area the leg placement of
That looks
the
like
officer,
it's on the
correct?
shoulder.
Yes, sir.
And based on your observation of this photograph, it appears that the shin is coming from the top of the shoulder across the shoulder blade, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it appears to be at an angle pointed in towards the squad car, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. We can take this down, Your Honor.
It's a good picture. Good point. This is why body cams are so important. What was that thing? Camera perspective
Accidentally
bias.
closed. Hang on one second.
Remember that term? A lot of people are asking why he's taking notes. When they're trying to prepare the defense, they're going over everything he's putting down. Where he thinks he got it
Sir,
wrong.
I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as 1046. Does that appear to be a similar angle?
Yes, sir.
And I apologize, it was actually Officer Lane's body-worn camera. 1045 and 1046. Again, can you see what appears to be the placement of the leg of one of the officers at the shoulder blade of Mr. Floyd?
It appears so.
You can see in this area here, what appears to be the back or the calf area coming across the shoulder blade, correct?
Yes, sir.
And does that knee placement appear to be similar to how a Minneapolis, or excuse me, similar to the placement in the previous exhibit?
The last exhibit, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was roughly a couple of minutes after, right?
Yes, sir.
I would offer exhibit 1046, 826, and permission to publish. This particular photograph, but if we look in this general area here, correct, you can see the placement of the knee, correct?
I can see the general area of the placement of the knee, yes.
And it appears to be in the center of the back, not on the neck. Again, great picture, great footage, great exhibit. See, this dispels all the emotion. He kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes. Oh my God, he killed him. He was a convicted felon. He was committing felonies. He swallowed drugs. He had drugs in his system. He was holding drugs, and he was fighting with the cops. No, Rick. He kneeled on his neck and killed him. Okay.
And again, here we have what appears to be the shin coming over the top of Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade,
That's what it appears, sir.
and that would be angled in towards the squad car, correct?
Correct.
You take that down, Your Honor.
Man, I guess the judge has to put up pictures and take them down.
Sir, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 1047. Does that also appear to be a still frame image taken from a body-worn camera of a Minneapolis police officer?
Yes, sir.
Timestamp being 8:27 and 49 seconds,
Yes, sir.
20:27:49, correct?
Correct.
And it appears that the officer wearing this body-worn camera has now stood up, correct?
It's a different angle, sir, yes.
From higher to lower, correct?
Lower to higher, sir?
It appears that the camera is at a higher angle, looking down.
Yes, sir.
And can you see in this photograph what appears to be the knee and shin placement of the officer?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that it appears that the knee is placed in the center between Mr. Floyd's shoulder blades?
It appears to be between the shoulder blades, sir, yes.
I'd offer 1047.
Oh,
Objection.
man, these are great pictures.
No objection.
1047 is received.
Permission to publish?
So my guess is when it's published, the jury can see it. And this is clearly his knee is on the back.
So again, here in this particular photograph, you can see the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee in between the shoulder blades of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it happens to be right here, that moment when the carotid artery is being palpated by the EMT.
Yes, sir.
Wow, I didn't know the hand was there. Perfect picture. So how can he be on his neck if he's checking his carotid artery? Wow. See, this is why with more information, your opinion should change. We have so many people that already made an opinion from emotion. This is why a trial and due process is so important. And this is why all evidence has to be given to the defense, because if the prosecution could have hid this, they absolutely would have, and they would have got a conviction easier. That's why due process is so important, people.
We could take this down. I'll show you one last photograph, sir. Again, does this appear to be a photograph taken from, or a still frame image of a Minneapolis police body camera?
Yes, sir.
Time being 10:28 and 29 seconds.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me, 20:28, 29,
2028, 29, sir, yes.
which would be 8:28:29.
Correct.
And again, can you see the placement of Officer Chauvin?
The reason why he's going over the time and stuff is you want to make sure for the record, if somebody's reviewing this, that he's looking at the same picture as the exhibit, and it wasn't just some other picture that we don't know.
Chauvin's knee.
Yes, sir.
Can you see Mr. Floyd's head?
Yes, sir.
I'd offer 1048.
Any objection?
Yes, they're all me.
No objection.
1048 is received.
Permission to publish?
Right now, the prosecution's
Again, it's a
nuts
little
are
hard to
shriveling
see
up.
here. You can see Mr. Floyd's head in that area,
Yes, sir.
and Mr. Chauvin, Officer Chauvin's knee between the shoulder blades of Mr. Floyd.
Yes, sir.
Does this appear to be a neck restraint?
No, sir.
Does this appear to be a prone hold that an officer may apply with his knee?
Yes.
Man, great points.
That down here.
Woo, doggies! This is a good day for the defense. He just made some
Now you
killer points.
Have talked about taking or holding a person in the prone position after they have stopped resisting. Do you recall talking about that?
Yes, sir.
And are there circumstances in your career where you have had to use your body weight to hold a suspect down for longer periods of time than, say, 2 or 3 seconds?
Yes, sir.
And are there times where you have had to use your body weight to hold a suspect down for 10 minutes?
I'm not sure if I have held somebody down for 10 minutes or not. I don't have a recollection of that, sir.
Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible.
And there are circumstances, again, that an officer has to take into consideration in terms of continuing to use their body weight regardless of whether the person is resisting or not resisting, right?
Rephrase that?
Sure. Sometimes an officer has called for EMS, correct?
That's correct.
And sometimes an officer may hold a person using their body weight to restrain them, awaiting the arrival of EMS, correct?
Yes, sir.
You've done that yourself?
I have.
And sometimes you had to, or was it fair to say that you've had to train officers to use their body weight to continue holding them until EMS arrives?
As long as needed to control them, yes.
You would agree that a scene where force has been used and a crowd congregates and is voicing their displeasure or their concern or whatever you want to say, that can be a chaotic situation for an officer, right?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree also that what you train Minneapolis police officers to do, relevant to their use of force, is to consider the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes, sir.
And you train officers that the decision to use force is from their perspective,
Yes, sir.
not the perspective, hindsight being 20/20.
That's correct.
That's the specific policy of Minneapolis Police Department.
It's the law.
I believe that's Graham versus Connor, sir.
That is encapsulated or incorporated into the Minneapolis Police Department policy on the use of force, correct?
Correct.
Because
Should have cleared up
situations are
Graham
rapidly
versus
evolving,
Connor is a
correct?
Supreme
That's
Court
correct.
decision.
And sometimes, just because an incident is 10 minutes long or 20 minutes long, that doesn't mean that it can't instantaneously change.
That's correct.
Right? What may not be a threat 1 second can be a threat the next.
Correct.
Have you ever been trained or trained others to say that if a person can talk, they can breathe?
It's been said, yes.
Is that true?
In terms of the continuation of the use of force, right? Or excuse me, not the use of the continuation. The graphic that we looked at in Exhibit 110. If we could just publish Exhibit 110, Your Honor. This is the Defense Control and Response Training Guide, correct?
That's correct.
Simply because a person is not actively resisting, right? That doesn't mean you can't use some degree of force, correct?
That's correct.
If a person is passively resisting, you can still use certain types of force, right?
Yes, sir.
That's down in this area here, correct?
Correct.
And that would include the use of joint manipulation, escort holds, pressure points, correct?
Yes, sir.
We could take that down here. Sorry. Sorry, we could take it down. You were asked a series of questions about the strike chart and the neck, the red, yellow, and green zones.
Yeah, it's called the Monadnock chart, sir. Yes, for striking.
That chart is designed specifically for punches, baton strikes, things of that nature, correct?
That's where we use that graph, yes.
In terms of the maximal restraint technique, you were describing the use of the maximal restraint technique.
Yes, sir.
And again, officers are trained to sometimes escalate the use of force in certain circumstances, correct?
Yes.
And de-escalate the use of force in certain circumstances.
Yes, sir.
If an officer decides initially to use the maximal restraint technique and then subsequently decides against it because of a medical situation or because of a lack of resistance, or would that be a de-escalation of the use of force?
Yes.
is it more or less difficult to render medical aid if someone is in the maximal restraint technique?
I would say it was probably a little bit more difficult to maneuver around that.
You would not be able to put them on their back, for example.
It would be difficult, sir, yes.
In terms of the use of force, part of the ground defense program is actually to use body weight as a form of de-escalation, is it not?
Yeah, it's use of force that may be used instead of higher escalations of force, yes.
But sometimes holding someone in a position can be a de-escalating technique.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, again, in terms of the use of force and deciding how much force should be used, the difference in size of an officer to a subject is a consideration,
It is a consideration, yes.
as well as the presence of other officers, right?
Yes, sir.
You would agree that basically the use of force in any circumstance is incredibly dependent upon the situation.
Yes, sir.
And when an officer is using force, they are to employ the critical decision-making model, correct?
They should be using that at all times.
But including the use of force.
Yes, sir.
And that critical decision-making model is not simply focused exclusively on the subject of the force being used, correct?
It's a situational awareness tool.
And the situational awareness extends beyond just the subject.
That's correct.
It extends to numerous factors.
Correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Wow.
Mr. Swisher.
What a great cross. This guy made big points. The prosecution absolutely has to try and undo all the damage that he did. Great cross. And this guy is being pretty non-biased and giving pretty good questions. Overall, I'd give this guy maybe an A-, B+ for being a good, credible use of force expert. And I'm usually a little more critical of these guys because I'm one, but this guy's pretty freaking good. And like I said, I think he should have elaborated and cleared up a couple things when he gave exceptions. Maybe the prosecution will come back and get him a chance to do that.
Your Honor. Regarding the use of force being reasonable in the eyes of the officer. That's what you answer the training is that right?
At the officer involved at the moment the force is used, yes.
But force is always subject to review, correct?
Yes, sir.
And review is always going to be after the fact, right?
That's correct.
And the force that's used and reviewed must be reasonable,
That's correct.
taken from that perspective, the perspective of the officer at the time, correct?
That's correct.
But the officer
See how quick he's trying to rattle off these questions? You can tell he's kind of shaken and he wants to get his information across. Well, you know what? I still have it on 125, so maybe that's the thing. I'm trying to catch up and kind of get past the boring stuff here.
doesn't have the unfettered discretion to use whatever force they wish.
No, they do not, sir.
Now, if we could take
I would disagree with that. Officers do have a choice on what force they use. They're just held accountable and responsible for the force they choose. But they absolutely have a choice.
publish the Exhibit 110 again, which is the control guide continuum. Right. And when we look over here on the left-hand side and we're talking about what force can be used and what's proportional, we see that the officer is to look at the subject behavior. Is that right?
For force on the subject, yes, sir.
And the amount of force that they use that's proportionate has to be proportionate to the subject's behavior, correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
So if, for example, a group of bystanders were doing something that the officer might find annoying, such as videotaping, right, that act would not be subject-controlled behavior, would it?
No, sir.
And that act would not justify the use of force or escalation of force by the officer, would it?
That alone, sir, no.
Because that's not subject-controlled behavior, correct?
Correct.
So if we could then publish Exhibit 184. Exhibit 184 has been received into evidence, and what you see here is a group of bystanders. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And a couple.
Notice he calls them bystander and not an angry mob or crowd, an angry crowd. They're just bystanders coming in the road, stepping off the road, yelling, calling, having to be held back by other people. No. This is just a crowd of peaceful protesters. That's it.
Couple of instances, you can see the bystanders have something in their hands, correct?
Yes, sir.
And those appear to be video cameras, is that right? Or smartphones.
Yes, sir.
That extra fact would not justify an increased use of force, would it?
Just the camera, sir? No.
So the point he's trying to make is they were just videotaping. They weren't a threat at all. So when the defense tries to say that it was an angry crowd, they were just videotaping. They weren't angry. He's just a liar. I mean, it's just flat out lies.
If you could take down Exhibit 184. The acceptable use of a knee across a subject's back, it's a transitory position, is that right?
Yes, it is.
It's meant to be used to gain control of the subject while the subject is being handcuffed.
Correct.
But all force must end at some point, is that right?
That is correct.
And once a subject is under control and no longer resistant, it's inappropriate to hold them in a position where you're draping your knee across their back or neck, isn't it?
I would say it's time to de-escalate for us, sir.
And get off of them.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the prone position in and of itself being something that can lead to positional asphyxia, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Would that risk be increased by the addition of body weight?
Yes, sir.
And so if an officer was placing body weight on the knee, with a knee on the neck or the back, or the the neck and the back, that would transfer the officer's body weight onto the person, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that would increase the restriction, I guess, decrease the ability of the subject to breathe. Is that right?
Potentially, sir, yes.
And it would not be, or I have to ask you, would that be appropriate to hold someone in a position where it's more difficult to breathe for an extended period of time after the subject has stopped offering resistance?
Can you rephrase that, sir?
Would it be appropriate and within training to hold a subject in that prone restrained position with a knee on the neck and a knee on the back for an extended period of time after the subject has stopped offering any resistance?
No, sir.
Or has lost their pulse?
No, sir.
We don't know if they
You
lost their
testified
pulse.
that an individual can be unconscious one moment and then suddenly become conscious and become violent, correct?
That is potentially, yes, sir.
Have you ever had a circumstance where an individual has lost their pulse and suddenly come back to life and
Did anybody know he lost his pulse?
become more violent?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Nothing further.
Not a very good recross. I'm glad it's over, but they're going to take lunch now, and this went an hour and 7 minutes. This is probably the best cross and the best use of a defense using the prosecution's expert witness against them. Although I still think he missed some points, this was a really interesting, good thing. Of course, this is kind of my expertise, so to speak, in one area of law enforcement, so I get into this a little bit more than maybe other people. Other people may find this boring. All right, we'll end that there.